All right. Hello and welcome to our webinar on measuring the impact of AI projects on business metrics. I'm your host, CJ Towell. I run product marketing here at Eppo, and I'm joined by Lukas Goetz-Weiss, who is our head of customer data science. I'll take you through the agenda today. The first thing we're going to talk about are some of these AI use cases that are in play today. I'm focusing on three specifically that are revenue critical and very important to these three businesses that we're going to feature. And then we'll talk about some of the challenges that they might have or other businesses looking to replicate that function might have uh, rolling out that AI. And then we'll cover a few Eppo use cases of similar challenges that are being solved with Eppo. Then I'll hand it over to Lukas, who'll take you through a demo of the platform, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. If you do have any questions, please post them in that Q&A box there at either the bottom or the top of your screen somewhere in Zoom, and we'll get those answered. Okay, now it wouldn't be a webinar if I didn't start with a McKinsey statistic. So of course, this won't be a surprise to really anyone, but most companies are using AI today, and even more companies are planning on increasing their AI investment in the next 3 years. So shocking no one, AI investment continues to grow. Where is that money going? So we'll look at three use cases from three major companies here. The first one we'll look at is Stripe. So Stripe recently rolled out their Stripe Agent Toolkit. That's an SDK that allows people to build agents that kind of serve as an intermediary and process transactions between humans and businesses. So very important. Stripe is all about payment processing. Um, Being able to have that function be done by an AI is obviously high risk. Real money is involved, and it's very critical to their core business. So the fact that they're enabling this means they're pretty well bought into using Gen AI for these kind of these high revenue use cases. No less important, especially if you're near lunch, kind of like Lucas and I are. But Pizza Hut also rolled out a chatbot. Again, Gen AI derived. You can see that down there in the bottom, that's a screenshot from iMessage. So you can basically just text Pizza Hut. Maybe some of you are trying it now and do an order through their LLM. You can do that through Messenger. You can do that through WhatsApp. It's not through the Pizza Hut app necessarily. It's basically just texting a friend that can deliver you pizza. And it's far from just a fun novelty that they've rolled out, right? This now contributes 60% of their total order volume and has about 100,000 user interactions per month. And then back over to the kind of payments and financial side, you can see that MasterCard there is using Gen AI to boost their fraud detection capabilities. So you can see they've increased fraud detection rates by about 20%. And so the through line again through all of these is that these Gen AI use cases are core and critical and tied heavily to major revenue streams for each of these companies, which is great. However, if you're looking to adopt AI yourself, there's a few things that you got to be concerned with and some challenges that I'm sure these companies are dealing with on a daily basis. So the main one is that, rather than being deterministic, AI is probabilistic, which means that the same input doesn't always necessitate the same output and drive that. And so when you're trying to test AI, when you're trying to see what's functioning, what's working, and so on, the results you get could be different than what a customer or a user is getting. They're inconsistent and unpredictable. On top of that, there's no shortage of organizations and groups trying to measure the effectiveness of AI. You can see plenty of benchmarks with every frontier model release. You can see all those online. However, they measure things like intelligence, which is kind of a loosey-goosey term, and then latency. And neither of those are directly tied to business metrics. And so, as a little preview of one of the use cases we'll talk about, it's hard to tell if you're kind of using too much AI, if you're using overkill, right? Are you paying more on a per token basis than you need to get the same results, or vice versa? Are you not paying quite enough? And should you invest in maybe a smarter model or a more expensive model to drive revenue? There's no way to make that connection kind of yourself today. And then finally, this is a space that's constantly changing. When preparing for this webinar, I was thinking about when DeepSeek R1 came out and all the waves that made and all the challenges. And I just kind of mentally, I noted that as like, oh, that was maybe about 6 months ago. For anyone curious, that was January 20th, so just over 2 months ago. So you can see how much the space is changing on a constant kind of pace. So it's very, very hard for companies to assess AI solutions, figure out if they're going to make them money, and then kind of consistently stay on top of that to ensure that they're getting the most out of it. However, that wouldn't be a very good webinar if we just set up the problem and didn't have any solution. So I'm going to hand you over to Lucas for now, who's going to talk about Eppo, a few customers that are actually using us to do just that use case, and then he'll take you to the platform and you can see how you can do it yourself. So thank you, Lucas.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, CJ. Cool. So we hop to the next slide here. We can actually fortunately see that all of the solutions to these problems can kind of be solved at the same time. For any company that's running kind of streamlined experimentation, you might see already how some of this fits into this set of problems quite naturally. So to start out with the first point that CJ was talking about these systems being black box, inconsistent, probabilistic kind of units. It turns out that's the basis of all A/B testing to begin with, right? If you think about running kind of classic A/B tests, you're also running on random systems, which are human behavior, right? If you ask someone what they think one day, you ask them something a few days later, it's going to be a different outcome. There's inherently kind of randomization as the whole, or sorry, variance and random nature to systems is kind of the whole reason A/B testing, exists in the first place. So very well suited for these kind of probabilistic systems like AI models. If we think about kind of connecting this to business metrics, and the second point here, anyone that's running experimentation at scale, or sorry, AI at scale, is going to already have good data infrastructure in place. They have ways to measure the KPIs they care about. That probably lives in a data warehouse somewhere. Fortunately, people that are running sophisticated experimentation programs can tie all this data back to that warehouse quite easily and understand kind of what is the impact that we're driving on not just the kind of latency metrics and maybe some like intelligence benchmarks, but what does it actually mean for our business, right? And then finally, when you think about these models changing quickly, and I was also going to mention the DeepSeek example there too, it's only a matter of time until some other kind of massive announcement comes out or some massive thing that's going to change the way everyone's thinking about AI. How can you position yourself to a place where you're not just learning once and then adopting that strategy? You're kind of have this always on approach to trying new things and learning stuff. And really the answer there is to reduce the cost of experimentation to zero, right? So with streamlined experimentation, you can reuse metric definitions and maybe even experiment designs so that the cognitive load and the additional overhead to running an incremental test is as close to zero as possible. So if we jump to the next slide here, we can see a couple examples from Eppo's clients where we're using experimentation for exactly this purpose. The first one is from a very fast-growing AI native SaaS tool where they're testing different models against each other. So, GPT-4o versus Llama 3.1 in this case, they ended up finding that by going with the open source solution, they saved over $50 million annually. That was, a very large impact for one experiment to be able to run. If we go to the next example too, we also see use cases that are, a little bit more subtle, right? Where one of our clients operates a three-sided marketplace. They added a new variable to search ranking. That variable was kind of powered by AI. A lot of work went into making that variable highly predictive of outcomes and who was going to click on what. But the result that drove was, just about a 1.5% increase in organic search revenue. So quite a big movement to a metric, especially this company at that scale, that translates to millions and millions of dollars. And the reason I wanted to highlight these two examples is, as we get into the kind of demo and talking about how Eppo fits in here, we'll talk a lot about these kind of like chat experiences, but there's a lot of other creative places where you can use AI from, turning unstructured data into structured data that then you use in kind of traditional predictive AI or machine learning applications, stuff like search ranking. So I just want to kind of highlight that the scope here is not just the chat interface for users, it's also deploying these models in a lot of other kind of backend services and potentially using them for stuff like, creating structured data and things along those lines. Cool. So with that, I'll take the screen share from you, CJ, if that's cool, and walk through what this looks like in practice. So let me pull up my screen. So I'm going to start out and talk through a real world example here where we're trying to optimize an AI sales agent. So, when you think about setting up a chatbot that's going to be in front of customers, there's a lot of decisions that kind of go into that. We can capture all those decisions in a feature flag here in Eppo called AI chatbot configurations. So when you set up a flag in Eppo, you can set it up in a lot of different ways. You can set up a basic kind of Boolean on-off switch, which is great for, I'm turning on a new feature, or maybe I want to set up a kill switch or something like that. You can also set up strings where maybe you want to change different model versions or different prompts or something like that. But you can also set up full kind of JSON dynamic configuration variants. So to show an example of that, we have this variation here where we're going to be controlling a lot of different components in how this sales AI agent actually interacts with customers, right? So we have some basic stuff like the provider. In this case, we'll just be using OpenAI. We can specify what model we want to use, in this case, 3.5 Turbo, and then also set up some guardrails like the max amount of tokens that we're going to use for a given request, and then also give some agent instructions here. So an example I'm going to walk through here, we're going to imagine we're selling used cars, which is, I think, kind of a hopefully relatable and kind of fun example. So we'll start out with a very simple agent instruction that says, help this person find a car in a professional tone. And then we can also pass in some additional content assets here. So now this is a set of configurations that we can go use in our application and figure out exactly how we're going to interact with OpenAI's SDK and API. So to show what it looks like to integrate this into your code base, I just have a very simple kind of Django app here that I'll just walk through briefly. But essentially, the integration is really just a matter of calling Eppo's SDK. In this case, we're going to use the get JSON assignment method. If you're using a Boolean, this would be get Boolean. All the flags in Eppo are kind of typed like that. You'll tell us what API, what flag we want to use. In this case, it's that AI chatbot configurations flag I was just showing in the UI. Will tell us what is the subject or the user that this flag is being evaluated for. This will really come in handy as we get into kind of randomized experiments and seeing how that fits into the workflow here. And then you also have subject attributes. So this is anything that might be relevant to the specific user that maybe we want to use for targeting, or maybe we want to use for downstream kind of analysis. So that's really the full extent of the integration with Eppo. From here, when we're actually calling OpenAI's SDK, we'll just pass in some of the configurations that we just got from Eppo. So first we'll check, okay, what provider are we using? Okay, if we're using OpenAI, that means that we should use OpenAI's SDK here. And then we'll go through and pass in, the model that we just specified in Eppo. We'll pass in the agent instructions, and then we'll also pass in any other kind of parameters. This is a very simple use case. Obviously, anyone who's been working with AI knows there's just tons and tons of other configurations and decisions you might want to tweak as you get further into it. But this just for the sake of a demonstration, I wanted to keep it relatively simple here. So now we specified what these parameters should look like. We've installed them into our code base. We can actually look at an example app here. So going back to this, selling cars example, I just have this simple Django app for a fictional company called Rust and Trust Motors. I have to thank ChatGPT for coming up with that name. But if I come here, I can actually start interacting with the sales agent down here, right? So I can say, hi, I would like to buy a car. And sure enough, we'll get a response back. And maybe there's some based on that agent instruction that we gave, it's going to tell us about some of the stuff on this page and kind of guide us towards hopefully a purchase decision, right? So that's great. So far, this is more an OpenAI demo than an Eppo demo. So now let's talk about how this can get a little bit more interesting as we think about changing some of these parameters, right? So the first thing we'll want to do is just specify the change that we want to look at, right? So I can come here and add a new variation. I can add as many variations as I would like. I already have one set up just for the sake of making this a little bit more straightforward. This is actually going to look the exact same as the last set of configurations. The only difference is now instead of saying a professional tone, I changed this to say a friendly, maybe even comedic tone, right? And we can see, does this lead to better interactions with the agent? Does it lead to higher conversions? Whatever that might be. So I'll go ahead and save that. So now I have two different versions. If I wanted to test other prompts or other models against each other, I would just keep adding more variations down here. So now that I've kind of specified the different versions of this, I want to go roll out and test. I can come to this assignments page, and this is where you can specify across your different development environments and then across your different user bases, who should be exposed to which different variation that we just set up. So far, I've just been working in the test environment, as you might expect. And I've been serving this professional variant by default. If I come here, I can change this to that new friendly comedic one I just set up. And sure enough, if I come back to our used car website and I say, hi, I'd like to purchase a car, sure enough, the response will be quite a bit, a little bit more friendly. And in prepping for this, I really got to appreciate how random these systems are because they always come up with some slightly different responses to that prompt there. But now you can see the tone here is quite a bit different. And we kind of feel good that this is actually all working through and changing that configuration as we update this. So that's great. Our local environment looks good. Now maybe we want to go push this up to production and see how actual users kind of react to this, right? So now I'll come up to production, and first thing I'll do is I'll turn this flag on so that we start serving it to any production SDK keys. And now we probably don't want to roll this out to everyone right away, even though we just tested it in our local environment. It's always good to just do a spot check to make sure that this is working as we expect. So what I can do is I can come in here and set up a new rule set that says internal users. They should all, and I can actually use a predefined, oh, sorry. I can actually just come in here and say, okay, if the email matches one of, I think earlier I called it example.dev or .com, then I want anyone that has that email domain to see this new friendly comedic variant. If I go ahead and save that, now in my production environment, any internal user will come in and see this new variant. We can go have one or two people maybe QA this and make sure we feel good about it before we actually go launch it to real end users. Once we've gone through that process, we can come in and do a very similar step where we'll say, now we want to roll this out to a potentially subset of users here again, where we can add all the same kind of targeting logic that we had before. But for now, I'm just going to actually roll this out to all users. So I'll just say all users, 50-50 split. Now, I said all users because everyone will be eligible for this test, but I probably don't want to actually show 50% of people. What if something is weird is happening with the way these models are reacting to that prompt? I might want to start out like much lower, right? So I can come in here and dial in, let's just say a 2% exposure to start. And this will just be a very low risk way to start exposing this new variant to users while being able to measure if there's any major impact to kind of behavior, right? And then over time, as we get more and more confident, we can, of course, ramp this up and get to a full kind of experiment rollout. So that's kind of the next step here. We're now collecting real data. We can go start checking to make sure all the sessions look good and everything. But probably from here, once we're actually comfortable, maybe we want to ramp this up back to, let's just say 100% to kind of move things along. And that's great. Now we're out there and this test is actually live. Obviously, the first question I'm sure people are wondering is how can we actually see if this is moving the needle in a meaningful way, right? So from there, we can just create an experiment analysis on top of this new traffic split, just right through the UI. So let me just call this updated agent prompt friendly tone. I can add a hypothesis here, and then I can select an experiment protocol. So a protocol is a way to pre-register experiment designs. And this is really nice because it means when you're running one net new experiment, you don't have to think through everything from scratch. I can hit this AI chatbot experiment. Like we've probably ran tests something like this before, and I'll actually see a set of pre-populated things here. So some of the background stuff around what are the configurations in Eppo we need to set up are going to be automated. But also the primary metric and guardrails are always going to be added here. So now any test that's running with this protocol will be targeting this purchase revenue per user metric, but we'll also monitor P95 response time as well as credits consumed per user. So if I go ahead and hit save there, that will take me to a page just to confirm the rollout and everything that we have so far. And from there, I can get to a comprehensive experiment report where I can see some metric results. I haven't actually ran this data pipeline yet, so there's nothing in here quite yet. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I can come in and I can expand on my hypotheses. I can add links to other elements in there, kind of full report builder here, which I'll talk about more in a bit. But let's now fast forward just a moment to an experiment that's actually already running. So I've been talking about this agent instruction comparison one, but I'm actually going to switch gears and instead talk about vendor comparison. And the main idea here is that, prompt engineering is cool and there's a lot of value you can drive by testing a bunch of different prompts against each other. But some of the ways to make the biggest swings is to just compare different vendors against each other. We're at this point right now where there's so many companies pushing out new models. There's a lot of price competition for people to, serve the best model at an affordable rate that people can actually scale with. Being able to compare, all these different solutions kind of in real time against each other just gives you a lot more leverage in going and negotiating those contracts, right? Where you can actually see, okay, maybe Llama is more performant than GPT or something like that. And that just for this moment where there's a lot of competition in the market, it's going to be a very important thing to be able to compare different solutions against each other. So coming back to this experiment, then all we're testing here is going to be two different model versions against each other. I'm not putting actual vendor names in here, but you can imagine you have model A from one vendor, and then you're comparing that to model B from another. And you can see this is just a finished kind of version of that report card I was just looking at once we have some actual data populating. And you can see a couple things here. First of all, you can see that the purchase revenue per user is up a lot, right? So it looks like this new model is monetizing at almost $90 more per user, which is great. You can see that it's actually faster too. The P95 response time is just over 6% lower for the new model, which is great. But we also see that the credits consumed is actually quite a bit higher, right? So we're driving better outcomes, we're giving a better experience to users, but at a higher cost. So it's not entirely clear, in this situation, what should we do, right? I think people that have run a lot of tests in the past have probably seen this case come up too, where you have some metrics that are positive, some metrics that are negative. It's a little bit hard to capture what those trade-offs look like. So Eppo will automatically give you some recommendations based on what we're seeing in the experiment so far. So in this case, we have this purchase revenue is up, but the guardrails are also significantly negative. So we need to think about what the trade-offs here and probably have a conversation with more stakeholders before we make a decision. I'll mention that this recommended decision piece here is not something that Eppo is going to come in and be really opinionated on. This is actually tied to that same experiment protocol I was showing earlier. And the idea is depending on your business and depending on the use case within your business, you might want to have different kind of rollout policies depending on what we've seen in a test. So in this case, we have it set up so that if there is a significant increase in your primary metric of revenue per user, and all the guardrails have passed some limited kind of downside risk threshold, we can go ahead and recommend rolling it out, right? Like we feel pretty confident that metrics are moving in the right direction. Where on the other hand, if you have a positive increase here, but some of the guardrail metrics like P99 are potentially showing some downside risk, and the way that we capture this is by a confidence interval that's really wide and it's actually not ruled out kind of negative impacts. Our recommendation is going to be to extend the runtime and just collect some more data. On the other hand, if we have a guardrail that's significantly negative, then we're in this situation where we're going to discuss with stakeholders. But all of these are configurable based off of your use case, right? So if you want to instead just say, no, if there's a guardrail metric that's negative, don't roll this out at all and make that the recommended solution. You can do that. And then everyone that's running a test through Eppo will see that recommendation in there. And that's going to be kind of tailored towards your use case and what you've decided as a company. So that's a little background on why this says to discuss results with stakeholders. From here, you probably want to dive a little deeper in before you actually make a decision, right? In this case, you've probably seen enough here to say, okay, well, I know it's a 17% increase in our AI spend, but it's a 10% increase in revenue. Chances are that's going to be compelling enough to actually roll this out, right? So you can go ahead and do that. I think a couple other checks that are nice before you step into that is to just look at the impact broken out by a couple different things. So we can look at kind of the lift that we've measured by days enrolled in the experiment. So oftentimes, you roll out a new experience, people might engage with it a lot to begin with, but then it kind of flattens out over time. This is pretty promising because, we see a consistent lift in that user's behavior over the entire course of their engagement, with this AI agent. You can also do things like just make sure that there's not specific regions that are being left behind, right? Like if there's something going on with localization, whether that's translation or something else, sometimes certain regions might lag a bit. In this case, it looks pretty flat across regions, so we feel pretty good about that. And at this point, we can probably go ahead and roll that out. So if I come here and hit make decision, you can log why we actually ended up making this. More money is good. And actually go ahead and conclude that test. And that's kind of the workflow, right? From there, we've now launched a new thing. We've seen the impact that it's had on all these metrics and can go ahead and make a decision and roll this out. If we ever want to go back and launch another test, then it's just the exact same process, right? So maybe this test has actually gone live, so we can get rid of that for now. But maybe instead of saying, I want to give this to 100% of users, maybe there's still a little bit of uncertainty in people's mind, right? And instead, we want to do a kind of some sort of holdback analysis, right? Where we say, okay, now for those users, we're going to give, 90% of them this new friendly comedic tone in this case. But then the other 10% are going to keep getting professional. And we can keep that running as long as we want, right? So maybe, now 90% of users are benefiting from this better set of configurations, but we can still compare some holdback group of 10% against that. So, as we observe this over 3 months, let's say, and some big change comes out, we can say, is this actually still as performant as it was before, or has something slipped? And now we think we might want to go back and kind of revisit our decision to roll out this new set of configurations. So that's a bit on the management of these configs and kind of rolling them out and testing them against each other. I think another question that is probably pretty top of mind is how does Eppo know any of this, right? I walked through kind of the setup of adding the SDK and adding some of those configurations into it. And using that to control the experience kind of in real time there. But how does Eppo have any idea what revenue looks like per user, or the percentage of users with referral, which is another example down here? And the answer to that is all based on this warehouse native architecture. So the way that Eppo computes these things is not by having its own definition of revenue, but instead going and running queries in our clients' data warehouses. So that could be Snowflake, Redshift, BigQuery, Databricks, one of those, and computing these things just like you would for kind of an internal analysis. Just to show what I mean by that, if you come to this diagnostics tab, you can see all of the SQL that Eppo is running to actually compute these numbers. And this is all local within your warehouse, right? So you can go test this yourself. You can go see, where are these numbers coming from? It's very kind of anti-black box. And it also means that the setup is really straightforward, right? So when you actually run an experiment with Eppo, the first thing Eppo is going to do is automatically log back some data based on the assignments that we made. So who saw which version of this configuration? You can see a list here where we have this chatbot tone experiment and the different variations that users saw, along with the timestamp at which they saw it, and then maybe some other kind of metadata about them. And that's all actually written back to your warehouse as the main source of truth. Eppo is not going to track this and put it in some kind of data silo. And then when it comes to adding metrics, it's a very similar kind of concept, right? So you'll just say, okay, here's how I compute revenue today in the warehouse. It's the same thing that's probably powering some sort of, leadership dashboard or whatever it might be. And you can just add that into Eppo, and then Eppo will know, okay, here's how I compute purchase amount. From there, we'll compile that kind of data pipeline that I was just showing. And then you can also dive really deep into how these numbers are computed and the actual pipeline that Eppo is running itself. So in addition to the kind of simple, like, here's how you pull the numbers, there's also, adjustments we make for things like Cupid, percentile metrics end up having some kind of more advanced math. You can come to this pipeline run history tab and see all the queries that Eppo is running. You can see the individual runs, so you can kind of dive in. It's very much like Finder on Macs, where you can kind of dive into the full directory structure here and say, show me every experiment or every query that was ran, along with kind of query stats. So this makes it really easy to manage. If you see a specific query you want to get more context on, you can dive in and see all the kind of stats around it too. So quite a lot of visibility and kind of observability into how Eppo is computing these numbers. And then from there, you have a very low cost kind of deployment of new experiments, very low cost setup of an analysis, because you can just add that protocol and will automatically pull in these data points from your own data warehouse. I think and then the decision making is also even very automated, right? Because we now have these recommended decisions. You kind of automated away almost all of the human part of the process, right? Of planning these things and rolling them out and making decisions. The last question is how can we go as fast as possible with the analysis itself, right? At this point, one of your main constraints is going to be sample size. Just how long does it take to actually measure the signal that we care about? The way Eppo can help with that, and what we've seen to be very efficient or effective, is using a Cupid model. So for anyone that's not familiar with Cupid, Cupid essentially says take some pre-experiment data or some other stuff we know about these users, predict their outcomes, and then look at deviations from that prediction as opposed to just the raw data itself. So if you can model what your users are doing anyways, you can use that to get much tighter confidence intervals and make decisions a lot faster. Uh, Eppo will, by default, build a pretty sensible model where we say take every metric that's added to the experiment and compute each user's value of that metric in the pre-period and use that to predict what's going to happen in the output, or sorry, the post-period. So, if a user was a power user beforehand, they're probably going to be a power user afterwards too, and we can control for some variance that way. But we also give you a lot of flexibility to specify your own model inputs there too. So if you go to this same definitions page I was looking at earlier, where we have these logs from Eppo's SDK, this is nice because this is going to track some of the basic kind of inputs that you might care about. But you can also add as much else as you want to this. So I can say like ML predictions or something, right? And I could say predicted purchase amount, right? We can add these other internal model predictions in as additional properties here and use that as further variance reduction. And the powerful thing with that is now as effective as your own internal models are for predicting user outcomes and forecasting that level stuff, now that's going to be leveraged in experimentation too. All right. So this concept is called QPAC. It's a little less known than Cupid, but the main idea is you're controlling for predictions after the experiment happens, as opposed to just the data. You can put in any kind of arbitrary model that you might care about and predict kind of the outcomes there. And then that will give you much, tighter confidence intervals. We've seen some people get like 60, 65% speed ups in experiment results by taking a method like that. So that's kind of that. That's like the floor as I see it at least of how fast you can run experiments because now we've kind of automated a lot of the human parts of the life cycle. We've squeezed whatever data we can out of a machine learning model to make this thing as predictive as possible. And now we can hopefully run dozens of tests in a month and be able to act on kind of all of them. I guess the last thing I'll mention before wrapping this up and opening it for questions is just what to do with kind of all these results. So we also have this insights page where you can go in and build a knowledge repository of all of the experiments that have ran recently. I spun up this workspace just for this webinar, so there's only one example in here. But what you'll see over time is that this builds up and you'll add screenshots of what you're testing. You'll add takeaways that you see. You can link back in and see the full kind of experiment report, of course. And then over time, this is all searchable, right? So you can add tags to kind of go back and look at what experiments we ran in the specific initiative in the past. You can search by team, by primary metric, all that. And the goal here is that over time, you'll build up that institutional knowledge so that you'll have a record of all the things that have changed kind of as you've tried new models out and tried new prompts and whatnot. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up the demo. I know we only have 10 minutes left here, but I think it'd be great to open it up and see what questions might be out there.
Yeah, and as a quick reminder, if anyone does have any questions, there's a little QA box at the bottom of your Zoom window, so you can go ahead and ask those. We do have a couple from kind of prior to the call that came in via email. So one is, how can I ensure that users aren't enrolled into multiple tests?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends a bit on the use case that you're talking about, but oftentimes it's best to kind of run overlapping experiments, right? So when you think about running individual parameter changes or something like that, like the best approach is just to randomize everything against each other, and then you don't have to compete with sample size. That said, for a lot of these types of tests where you want to look at like individual parameters and maybe change one at a time, like you can't necessarily, you can't test different you can't test like GPT 3.5 versus 4.0 and run that test across both OpenAI and Anthropic or something like that. That doesn't make any sense because those models are kind of specific there. So there is also an option in Eppo to do kind of mutually exclusive layers, which I didn't include in this demo here just because most of the time we kind of encourage overlapping tests. But if that is ever a thing that comes up, and it is a little bit more relevant for AI initiatives in general, so that's also something that's kind of supported out of the box here.
Okay, and then this is referring to that kind of 10-90% split holdout where we don't show the certain prompt to 10% of that group. Do I need to use Eppo's feature flags to run a holdback group?
So if you're using your own, so everything with Eppo it's kind of modular, right? So you can bring your own feature flagging solution if you want. To do the hold back thing specifically, I mean, so there's two kind of concepts. There's like a hold back, which is one test. I just don't want to roll it out to everyone. I want to only roll it out to 90% of people, and get it a separate kind of independent measurement. That thing is it's essentially just another experiment. So you would just run that in your own system that you're using to randomize and then analyze that in Eppo side by side. Um, so for that, like it doesn't necessarily have to be an Eppo. The other concept is a hold out, where you say, I want to keep some traffic that's like exactly like the world was 3 months ago and compare all the changes against that. For that piece, Eppo does have a solution out of the box. Again, you could just use that in another system and just analyze the results in Eppo. But for that, Eppo would have some nice kind of streamlined stuff that plugs into the rest of the analysis platform.
Okay, and a couple more rolled in. I promise we'll get to all these. So given your data, how do you decide on the duration of the test?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for that, let me actually show just another workspace here that has a better example. But we have a dedicated sample size calculator. So I reload this. So when you're planning a test, it's a great question because you always want to make sure you don't reach that end conclusion where you see, you've reached your end date, but you actually don't have conclusive evidence or it's still really wide confidence intervals. We have this dedicated sample size calculator. So the way that it works is you'll just tell us what unit are you trying to run your experiment on. FO supports like multiple randomization units. So maybe you want to run some user level tests. Maybe you want to run some like company level tests if you're B2B, or like session level if you have kind of like an e-commerce thing and people aren't logged in all the time. You can even run like kind of quasi experiment geo level tests. But anyways, for now, I'll just pick user, and then you'll map in what we call like a entry point. So these are all the different moments in the user journey that you might want to launch a test. So I'll just say like user start search for now as an example. And then you'll tell us what metrics you care about. So these are all the same exact metrics you'll use to analyze the experiment. We pulling from the same data sources in your warehouse. And then once you hit run, you'll see a table that looks something like this, where you can see, okay, for every time window, like let's say I run this for 4 weeks, I'll see 60,000 subjects get enrolled into the experiment. And then I can also check what my minimum detectable effect, so like how large of a signal will I be able to measure, or rather how small of a signal will I be able to measure. So in this case, you can see revenue per user, I could measure 3.7% within 4 weeks. And this is also nice because this is again a bit advanced, but you can also look at different stats methods and see how they compare. So if you wanted to do, like a standard t-test as opposed to something that's robust to peeking at results every day, you might get a tighter interval at the end of the day. And you can kind of play out those different scenarios in this analysis plan settings section. But great question, though.
Okay, another one here. Should Cupid still be used when the experiment includes a decent share of new users for which no pre-experiment data is available? In other words, are there any scenarios when Cupid should not be enabled?
Yeah, it's a great question. So on one hand, Cupid can never hurt because it can only reduce variance. And even if your predictors have nothing to do with outcomes, like you'll just get the same results as you would had you not had Cupid enabled. Cupid does typically have a smaller impact for new users for exactly the point you mentioned there because you don't have that pre-period data. That said, we still do see decent variance reductions just based on adding other properties that we know about the user, even if they're brand new. So things like what source did they come in on? What did they do before they interacted with this specific experiment? Sometimes there's just enough data there you're not going to get like a 60% speed up like I was talking about earlier, but you will at least get like, we typically see closer to like 5-10%. So it's still a nice thing to have, but it's not going to be as impactful. I would say if you're running a test that's on a mixture of new and returning users, it's still very impactful because just the fact that they're a new versus existing user can explain a lot of variance too. So there you see, more impressive kind of speed ups.
Okay, that does it for Q&A. Although if you have any others, please submit them. I'll do just a quick rundown and wrap up, and if any come in between now and then, we can answer those. But I'll say that a couple kind of outcomes of this. Oh, we actually just got one. Um, How do you rule out biases like seasonal effects or geographical effects on a test result?
Yes, that's a very great question. I mean, so in general, the beauty of like randomization is that you're going to get the same distribution of people across the country, right? So like or across any other regions you might be operating in. So on average, they're going to be the same across both groups. Cupid can also adjust for some of those random fluctuations where maybe you got more people in New York and maybe there was a snowstorm that week and less people left the house or whatever. So Cupid can do some of those random fluctuation adjustments. For things like seasonality, that's a really great question because in a sense, there's no way to say for sure that an experiment that ran in the winter is going to have the same effect as it will in the summer, right? So practically speaking, that's where a little bit of like the domain knowledge comes in, where you say, okay, we ran this test. We have a lot of like sports booking apps as clients of ours, and obviously when like March Madness is going on, everything looks very different, right? So like you would know to say, okay, a test ran during that period. We should reproduce it in the summer just to make sure that we see the same results. That's a great place for holdbacks or holdouts in general, is to be able to measure those kind of long run impacts, but also just being able to iterate on tests fast and run a smaller version of that same test later on in the year can be a good way to kind of give you more confidence that the change is actually robust across like all these other macro effects like seasonality and just other things kind of changing in the world.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so as you can see on Lucas's screen there, go ahead and visit us at geteppo.com. If you're an existing customer and you're interested in running some of these use cases, please reach out to your customer support contact. They'll be able to help you get set up. If you're not an existing customer, go to that URL you see there, and you have the option of either trying out our preview app and kind of poking around and clicking on your own if you prefer that, or you can reach out to the sales team and they can help you get set up with an AI experiment like this. This session was recorded, so we'll send this out if you know of anyone that couldn't make it that would be really interested in seeing this, or if you just want to watch it again for some reason. But either way, from both Lucas and I, thank you very, very much for joining. We had so much fun running this, and we hope to see you at the next one. So thank you.
Thank y'all for joining.